election, and it has to be filed within 30 days of purchasing your stock. And if you don't file it in that period, you're just out of luck.
You talked about bad exit, and we actually saw a few very sad examples in the past years of Israeli entrepreneurs that relocated to the U.S. and had some serious issues with that, and they suffered. When they exited, they really suffered. And there are ways to mitigate that risk, and we can advise if it's applicable.
So if a client's thinking about going into the U.S., do you guys file an 83B?
Either we do that or we accelerate their vesting. But tax treatment is very individual.
Yeah.
So we kind of accommodate it to the specific client.
Yeah. So I guess if you haven't formed and you're thinking about forming a company and you are thinking about going into the U.S., maybe you want to file an 83B election. Just it's protected. So, you talk about 2-year vesting here. Often, when you've got founders that start at the same time, but one founder's core competencies really aren't going to come into play until a later point in time, right? So let's say one person's, a product person, right? You've got to have a product for someone to be a product person or salesperson, right? So their core competencies are really going to only come into play 12 months, 14, 18 months down the road. So just having a 2-year or 3-year vesting doesn't really help you, because ultimately, if you want to ensure that people have the right amount of equity that's commensurate with the contributions they're going to make, if you have a very short vesting period and someone's core competencies aren't going to come into play until 2 years down the road, well, they're going to be fully vested before you know whether or not they're going to provide any benefits, right? So when my founders are typically looking at vesting, I'll say to them, just do a gut check. Say, if your co-founder walks away after 6 months, 9 months, 24 months, 36 months, and they take X% of the company with them, will you feel good about it? If they do everything that you think they're going to do, if they execute on what you think they're going to execute, will you feel good about it? And if yes, the vesting's fine. If you say, you know what, after 6 months, she takes 25% of the company, I won't feel good about that. That means the vesting is too short. That's just a gut check thing. The one thing I see in Silicon Valley all the time is just plain time-based vesting. And I'm thinking about not only for founders here, but when you're bringing on employees. So I call time-based vesting pulse-based vesting. Why do I call it pulse-based vesting? Because you wake up the first of every month, you check to see you got a pulse. Got a pulse? Yep. All right, I vested 148 or 136. Did you provide any value? It doesn't matter. I've got a pulse, so I vested. And so I think that's sort of the default in Silicon Valley. It's the easy button. You bring somebody on, you give them pulse-based vesting. So don't be a slave to convention. I think the one thing I really try and impress upon my entrepreneurs is to think about their company, think about what really is appropriate for their company. So after 2 years of my company, I woke up and I looked at my cap table and all these people, so when I sold that about 650 employees, but I must have gone through 2,000 over 10 years to get to that number of employees. But after 2 years, I remember waking up and just going, wow, all of these people on the cap table, collectively they've got such a big chunk, and most of them weren't there. And I said, they just did not provide the value that warranted this chunk of a company. And I just said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm absolutely not going to do that. When I give equity, I'm going to do whatever I can to mitigate the risk that someone will have more equity of my company than value they provided to them. And so this is just a way that I kind of want to hopefully get you guys thinking about as you're granting equity, saying, what can I do to mitigate the risk for that employee or that consultant or whatever, having more equity than value that they provided. So one thing that I used to do that I think worked out very well for certain hires, before I actually hired the individual, and especially if it was someone that can move the needle, like a sales, VP sales or whatever. I found that whenever I hired someone, after I hired them, they were way too busy to give me a plan. But if I asked them for a plan before I hired them, I got all kinds of plans. So when I got down to the top 3, 2, 3, 4 candidates for a position, I would ask them for a plan. Say, give me a plan, tell me quarter by quarter, what are you going to do, what are you going to achieve, and how are you going to achieve it. If you're VP sales, it doesn't help me just saying, oh, well, in 5 years' time, we're going to be $100 million. Right? That's totally useless. Tell me over the next 8, 12, 16 quarters, quarter by quarter, what is your plan and how are you going to achieve your plan? And the reason I used to do this was a few different reasons. Number one, it gave me an opportunity to think about how people thought about my company and their role in my company. Because, you know, when you interview people, everybody talks a great game, right? Everybody talks a great game and everyone says they can do all these things. But if you make them give you a plan and really they have to sit down and think about how they see themselves in your company, it's sometimes very telling. Number one. Number two, it gives you an insight into their critical thinking skills. Number three, if you are like most entrepreneurs, like I was, where you don't have a whole lot of money to hire a whole lot of experts, it's kind of like you fake it till you make it, right? So you think, you know, people think you know what you're talking about, and then ultimately you get enough knowledge where you actually do know what you're talking about. So maybe you guys are all completely different and you know it all. But for me, it wasn't the case. It was a lot of faking until I got the knowledge. But often what I would pick up a lot of good ideas and good tips from people's plans. So even if I didn't hire them, it would sort of be this building of institutional knowledge. And sometimes I would actually implement, you know, some of their ideas. But most importantly, I think the fourth reason I would ask them for a plan was because I would use their plan to compensate them, maybe bonus, maybe equity, vesting. So if they said they were going to produce, you know, all of these things over 12 months, 24 months or whatever, often what I would do is take the plan and discount it, maybe discount it by 30%, 40%. Because, you know, people are trying to get a job, giving you a plan, so there's a lot of, you know, profit. So you discount it by 30, 40% and say, okay, I'm taking your plan based on what you said you're going to do, and I'm going to base your vesting on your plan. So if you achieve X within 6 months, right, then a certain portion of your equity will begin to vest. So why have an artificial 12-month cliff, right? Because that's just saying, okay, if you have a pulse for 12 months, then 25% of your shares will vest. But if you say, okay, if you achieve X within 6 months or 12 months, then a certain percentage of your equity will vest. So it would kind of look like this. Often what I would do is say, let's say you're giving somebody, you know, 10%. Say, okay, if you achieve this within 6 months, then you know, 1% will begin to vest over 42 months. If you achieve that within 12 months, then maybe 2.5% will begin to vest over 36 months. So everything's fully vested at the 4-year mark, but you're setting these goals and objectives that will trigger the vesting. So again, my philosophy was, what can I do to mitigate the risk that someone's going to have more equity than value that they've actually provided? And having the mini cliffs were based not on whether or not they have a pulse, but on whether or not they've actually performed, you know, worked out very well for me. And I ended up with far fewer people that had big chunks of equity that haven't provided value. Because, you know, as you grow your company, you're going to have people that aren't performing, right? And you're going to give them more time, you're going to give them more time until it gets so bad that you actually terminate them, right? But then they've vested, they've got a certain amount, and, you know, you typically don't feel good about it. But this way, if somebody performs, and again, you've taken their plan, you've discounted by 30, 40, 50% or whatever it is, you're saying, okay, if you do half of what you said you're going to do, you'll vest. And often what I would do is I would back-end load the vesting. So if you're giving somebody 10%, doesn't mean if you've got, you know, 4 milestones, you're going to give 2.5% for each milestone, right? Start with 0.5% for the first one, right? And then back-end load it so you're creating more stickiness, because the bigger chunks only start vesting later. So you're creating more stickiness to the company, and you're mitigating the risk for yourself.
I think that, sorry for chiming in, I think that's a great idea, but if you're an Israeli entrepreneur and you are incorporated here in Israel, before before you commence any milestone-based vesting, you should advise with counsel because Israeli tax authority might have an issue with that and you need to tailor-made it to address their needs.
So can you get around it in some way?
You can get around it, but I would advise with local counsel.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything I'm saying, you should advise with local counsel.
Right.
And you got great local counsel right here. So, but yeah, what you want to ensure is that you don't have the tail wagging the dog, right? Because there are also, in the US, there are also issues you have to think about. I'm trying to give you at a high level ways to think about your company, about incenting people to ensure that the right founders, the right early employees have the kind of exit that they should have, and that you don't have people that really haven't provided value getting what they should get.
But we see that more and more in Israel,
Yeah.
the performance-based vesting.
Well, that's great. And I think there are a number of situations where it's appropriate, some that aren't. So, so the issues that I see with vesting, I guess one of the big ones that I see is part-timers. Does anyone here have people working for them part-time, nights and weekends? No, everybody's full-time? Okay. The issue that I see with part-timers is, if you've got full-time job at Google and you're like working on my startup nights and weekends, kids get in the way, life gets in the way, baseball games get in the way, and it's not the most important thing, in your life because you've got like one toe in, I'm all in, I've got a second mortgage on my home, I'm totally in. And so pulse-based vesting just typically isn't appropriate in those situations. So, something that I also do with part-timers, and this is totally, I never see people doing this, but a lot of the stuff that I do, a lot of people don't do. So I'm a little bit out there in certain things, but to me it makes sense, and to a lot of my founders it makes sense. So if somebody's working part-time, right, they say, you know what, I'm going to stick with my full-time job at Google, and when you get funding, I'll come in full-time, right? So again, when you're thinking about a mindset of how do I mitigate the risk of somebody having way more than they've actually produced in terms of value, so you know what we're going to do is we're going to start you off with an 8-year vesting. So you'll vest at the rate of $196 a month, and if you come in full-time, either when we get funding or within a year, so if the CEO says, hey, come on in, we've got funding now to pay you your salary, if you come in, there'll be catch-up so that you'll be fully vested in 4 years. And so the initial gut reaction a lot of the time is people throw up all over it. The people that are potentially going to be subject to 8-year vesting. But we say, look, you've got the primary founder who's all in, right? They quit their job, they've gone all in. They're vesting over 4 years. You've still got both feet in a Google, you're doing this nights and weekends. Would it be equitable for you to vest at the same rate as the founder who's all in? No, it's not equitable. Why should the two people, vest at the same thing? And again, talking about early employees and talking about true co-founders, if you've got an early employee, it doesn't mean because you're 4-year vesting that they have to be too, especially if it's part-time vesting. But you're mitigating the risk. If they only, if they're vesting at 4 years, then after 1 year they're 25% vested. If they're vesting over 8 years, they're 12.5% vested. But again, it's also an incentive for somebody to come in and join the team full-time when you get funded because they're going to catch up to a 4-year vest. Has anyone seen this? Probably not. It's a bit out there. But does it make sense? Is this something that anyone would try, or would that be like suicide?
I think it does. I think it does make sense, but I rarely see part-time employees get stock options in early stage startups.
Really? So are they get compensated in cash, or they just don't get anything?
Well, sometimes it's mostly cash. When after seed investment, there are part-time employees, interns, and after seed investment, of course.
Yeah, but before the seed investments, I've got a lot of clients where like some people are all in and some people are not all in. And this is for the people that are not all in.
Right.
So your people are working part-time, are they gonna come in full-time? Do you want them to come in
We want
full-time?
them to come, but there's still, I think the compensation based on salary or hourly based on such.
So they're getting some pay.
Yeah, but
They don't-
definitely the sale, maybe the promise is that once the company will get funded or maybe get to the next stage and they will come on board, they will get bigger chunks.
Yeah, so the problem with that is that the value is gonna be much higher post-funding. So their upside is diminished because they're getting stock later. So they'll get less stock and it will be at a higher price. So if you can use this to give them stock earlier with the promise of a much bigger upside, maybe you could get more out of it. I don't know. Any thoughts about this?
What I commonly see is that when people are working part-time, they just get the relative number of shares. So that's represent the part-time job.
I didn't quite get that.
So if for example, I get VP, I'm reviewing this, let's say we take a CFO part-time, okay? Half of the time. And if he normally gets 1%, then he will get 0.5%. So that will represent half or more.
Yeah, but if you really want to incent them, wouldn't it make sense to give them the full amount at double the vesting, so that they're incented when you need them to come in, that they'll come in?
That's an interesting offer, but normally how it works in Israel is they get the relative, the right, so the percentage of your part-time job of the.
Yeah. So I guess maybe it's just, philosophically people want, they say, look, it's not my fault you don't have funding, right? But for a CTO, I would get X, right? I'd only take half X and then get the other half once you fund it, because I've got a much smaller upside because it's going to be triple the valuation, right? So I'm okay with doing much longer vesting but at least I'll have the strike price, at a much lower strike price.
That's very unique. And normally when I see these cases, it's when you really want to bring someone which is really, hot shot in some specific area and you want him in 20% because you cannot afford to have him 100% and maybe he doesn't want it. So normally these people will not agree to wait 8 years.
Well, we can also attribute it to the fact that, again, in Israel, if you're hiring U.S. Employees, that's a different story. But in Israel, you don't have to issue stock options. You don't have to issue options at a fair market value. You can issue them at nominal value, and that refers to some of the other comments.
At any point in time?
At other points in time, right? Mm-hmm.
And so there are no tax consequences for the individual?
Well, we have a certain route here in Israel that is recognized for stock options. It's called the 102 route, and you have to qualify to do certain, like to issue the shares to a trustee, and there's a holding period, but you can issue shares, you can issue options that...
So if you can get around it,
right,
then it's not such a big deal.
right.
But, I always felt like I wanted everybody to have a stake in the company, in my company, like from the receptionist, through, people in the warehouse. I wanted them to feel like they had an ownership piece of the company. But if you don't have to do it, you don't have to do it.
What's everybody's opinion about that? Like giving every employee,
Yeah, what do people do here? Do people give everyone, or is it just for certain individuals? What do you do? What's your opinion?
no, I'm not there yet, but I think part of them needs everything, not all of them.
Key person.
Key
Just key
person,
people?
Key people, yeah.
obviously management, team leaders, key person.
Kind of depends on the nature of the company, right? If you're very much operation based, right, people will probably, there will be high rotation of personnel, and it just doesn't make sense. But if you're, around, I don't know, something that says high intellectual property, you're into huge research and you bring in biologists like there's no tomorrow, you want them to feel part of the company, right? You want them to work extra hours, you want them to contribute so it really depends on that, I guess, right? Kind of soft motivational aspects.
Any other thoughts? I guess it's a different sort of philosophy. I think in Silicon Valley, everybody kind of expects. So at my previous firm, my assistant left, and she went to a startup. I completely forgot about it. And about 6 months ago, I ran into some friends from my old firm, and I said, "Hey, did you hear about Susie?" I was like, "No, what happened to Susie?" They said, "Oh yeah, she went to that startup and she's exiting now, and it's worth $32 million." I'm like, "What?" Like
Her cat?
her piece.
Yeah.
So I said, like, what are you talking about? Remember she left you and went to that startup? I was like, "Yeah, you don't remember the startup?" I go, "No, it was Facebook." She was number 3. It was like Zuckerberg's right-hand person. When I went to like do some Googling, the desks were like this. She was here, he was there. I don't know what she got. Look, if they gave the guy that did a mural 1%, I don't know what he gave Susie. But I said, "Man, leaving me was the best thing that she ever did."
I heard about the masseuse of Google.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's just part of the culture there that everybody gets. For retention purposes, for morale, to get everybody focused on certain things. And look, they don't get very much. I mean, typically speaking.
What do you mean? In what range?
Well, look, someone, you're a more mature company, now you're Series A funding, they're typically bands. So you've got VP, you've got down to administrative, and so maybe at the very low levels, they'll be getting 5,000 shares, 10,000 shares. So people, companies use it also for reviews, right? So they give maybe not that much cash in terms of bonus, but they give a little top up in terms of options. So they use it, they value the stock, they make the employees feel like it's very valuable and that they have, a stake in the company. Even though, because they don't know what the percentage is, right? They just know they're getting 7,500 shares.
They want to ask. They can know.
Well, yeah, I mean,
You don't have to answer.
yeah, I mean,
Well,
I always do.
don't know.
I drummed it into everybody saying you should always ask what does it represent on a fully diluted basis. So my buddy was going for the role of VP Finance at Twitter before they went public. I said, just make sure whatever they offer you, say what does that represent on a fully diluted basis. So they offered him the position and they offered him 250,000 shares. And he said, "So what does that represent on a fully diluted basis?" And they said, "We're not telling you." He said, "What do you mean?" Like, my lawyer told me I always got to know what this is. They said, "Look, we're giving you $2 billion valuation. We expect to go IPO $4 to $6 billion. So you can figure out what your upside is,
Right.
So it doesn't, it doesn't always work.
I don't get this answer. This is a matter of trust. You have to be open. People.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if you're Twitter and you're about to go public, it's a different story as opposed to being sort of an early stage startup. One of the things that I do quite often is to get a proxy. Do you use proxies at all?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So when I've been doing it probably for about 15 years.
Oh, from founders or
Yeah.
from option holders?
From anyone. This could be early employees. It could
Right.
be certain founders. It could be optionees. So I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I always used to worry like, is this going to get tested in court, right? And then finally, when Facebook went public, my proxy idea was kind of validated. So Zuckerberg, when they went public and they raised how many $1 billion they raised, he only controlled 32% of the shares. But he owned 32% of the shares, but he controlled 64% of the company. Proxies. He got from all his co-founders, all his early employees, and his early investor, Vinod Khosla, gave him a proxy, vote his shares. So, look, if you're Zuckerberg, maybe you can do that, right? But for all of the rest of us, you're not going to get your investors to give up their voting rights. But, often I see situations where you've got an early employee that's getting a pretty significant chunk of stock. So, let's say you bring in someone, they're demanding and you're prepared to give 20, 25% of the company. It's a huge chunk. And again, just remember that my goal in working with my founders is to ensure that they can maintain control long enough so that the ship is set, the course, and their position is entrenched. So if you're bringing someone on very early, they've got a disproportionately large share, try and get a proxy from them. Because otherwise, if they leave the company, they've got this big chunk of shares, you've got to go hunt them down every time you want a shareholder vote. They're not involved in the company, then you've got to justify the vote. I typically don't get a whole lot of pushback. Sometimes we do, and so we say the proxy only becomes operative in the event of a termination of service from the company. But at least, you know, and especially if you've got people with 5%, 3%, 7%, a whole bunch of people with smaller percentages, so you as the primary founder are going to lose control. But if you aggregate all of these small percentages under a proxy, you're going to maintain control for a longer period of time. So whether they're optionees or they're shareholders, it doesn't really make a difference. If you're giving somebody a pretty big chunk of options, then yeah, you want to, you know, potentially get a proxy from them. Has anyone here used proxies? So you say you use them for optionees.
Mm-hmm.
What's the circumstances that you use them for optionees?
To the extent an employee exercises his options, then he receives the shares, and these shares are subject to the proxy.
And that proxy is put in place before they get the option, or when they exercise?
It's in place before they get their options. And also we see that in some certain rounds, like seed investments, some investors are willing to give those proxies, and obviously if there are friends and family involved, they are willing to give this proxy.
Those are the people I would be worried least about.
Right.
You know, well, it depends, you know, if you're
Right.
a close family, but yeah. So I think this is really important.
Actually, the news from today about the LinkedIn founder.
Oh, yeah?
64% of body weight, so he can actually.
Is that Reed Hoffman?
Yeah.
So he's got 64% of the vote, and what percent does he own?
I think like something like 12, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow. So he could never be fired, right? If the board fired him, he would just call a special shareholder meeting,
Right.
reconstitute the board,
Right.
rehire himself. And we talk about job security, you know.
12%?
Yeah, because you control 64% because he's got proxies.
Control. Oh, so this is gives
So
you the
majority-
power of the shareholders?
The majority of the shares elects the board.
Right,
The board hires and fires the officers.
right.
So if you get fired and you get more than a majority, you just reconstitute the board
This is very, very
and
important.
get back in business. So yeah, absolutely, really, really think about this situation with the proxy. Sometimes I see this, people say, you know what, I'm not gonna assign the IP to the company until I know that I've got an investment. Is there an issue in Israel when you assign IP, like sort of later on when there's much more value to the company?
Yes, that's a
Yes.
problem.
Tax issue.
Mm-hmm.
So the same thing in the States. You want to make sure, look, you're all in with your company, holding on to your IP because you're scared that maybe, you know, it'll be lost. You know, it can really lead to issues down the road. One of the things that I really try to impress on my founders, and I think you should make sure that anyone that touches your company is they have some kind of agreement in place which automatically assigns all of the IP that's generated to your company. I mean, I had a deal recently, it was about $150 million deal, so not a huge deal, but some data entry people in Costa Rica and El Salvador didn't sign these proprietary invention assignment agreements. So the firm on the other side made us send people down to Costa Rica and El Salvador to get something signed that says that they didn't have any rights or any claims to IP. So the funny thing is, so for consultants that are not working for you anymore, that didn't think they had anything valuable, when someone shows up at their door and says, you must sign this piece of paper to sign away rights that you didn't know you had, so it cost us $2.5 million to get these data entry people to sign this piece of paper. So just right from the get-go, anyone that touches anything to do with your company, make sure that they sign these agreements, because remember, and I'm sure it's the same here, but definitely if you get funded in the US, there are representations and warranties in your Series 8 documents. And it will say something like, every current and former consultant and employee has signed something like this. And from an investor standpoint, they want to ensure that there's integrity to your IP, right? That there's this sort of chain of title that you can point to and say, all of these people work from this, and all of these people have these agreements. Because if there's any gap in that chain, they're going to say, hey, does that person potentially own some of the IP that you say, makes you valuable? So you guys do the same thing here, I would imagine?
Exactly, same exercise.
It's automatically assigned. In my founder's agreement, we take care of all of the pre-incorporation stuff by saying part of the purchase price is for your IP as well. And then going forward basis in the employment agreement or the consulting agreement, you've got everything that's produced down the road. And it's amazing. I mean, I know that people think bad things don't happen to good people, but when things go sideways sometimes between founders, and you have just forgotten to do an agreement like this, it's just unbelievable. The animosity, when you think that two people are never going to turn into these kind of people, it's just amazing. But I've seen a company being held hostage because the one founder just forgot to sign, and then things went bad, and they just never thought that it would come to this. And it's now we're in this dispute where basically the company doesn't own what they thought about. So this is kind of a
Okay.
topic that probably is not going to be of a whole lot of use to you, but I just want to mention it just in case you do come into the US and you have to set up a Delaware entity. So nobody really, I'm not sure why, but in the States, no one really does a whole lot of this. This is called Series FF Preferred Stock. And this really is just if you think about going into the US. If you want to get liquidity before you actually have an ultimate exit, and you're in the US, there are issues, right? You can either sell your common stock at sort of an inflated price, and that kind of will hurt your optionees, or you can sell at the lower price and you get hurt. So this Series FF preferred stock is a share which has a convertible feature. It allows you to convert into common stock, or it allows you to convert into the next round of preferred. So, because private companies are staying private for much, much longer, there are founders that want to get liquid. And so they're faced with a situation